which sounds super interesting, and is currently researching the relationship between screen studies, universal values, and the politics of representation, which is, I think, what you're going to talk to us about today.
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and it's been wonderful since July when I came. Thanks to especially to Kevin for his support, to Amanda for leading the TMIC seminar, which I found so interesting. Thanks to all and everyone coming. My talk today, as Amanda was advancing, is entitled Negotiating Representation in Contemporary Screen Media, Paratext, Identity, and the Politics of Engagement. I want to begin with a simple observation. Debates about representation in film and television have become some of the most predictable cultural events of our time. Every few months, a new controversy erupts about casting, about authenticity, about diversity, and the patterns feel strangely familiar or similar. My goal today is not to join exactly those debates, but to understand their mechanism. Why do they keep repeating in such similar ways? What makes outrage itself so reproducible? I'll argue that what we call culture wars are not only ideological, they are also structural. They are built into how contemporary media circulates meaning through platforms, algorithms, and crucially, through the paratext, the trailers, thumbnails, casting announcements that prepare us to feel before we even see the story. While public debate shows us who disagrees, it not usually explains that much how those disagreements are mechanically produced and amplified. So my project tries to fill that gap in the realm of film and television studies by tracing the circuitry that turns representational choices into predictable anger. In short, the question is not what people fight about, but why they fight about representation in such pattern mechanical ways, and what that repetition reveals about how the politics of representation now operates under streaming and platform and social media conditions. Well, when I first started this project, because I come from a different subfield in the television screen studies area, when I started this project, I had a simple, almost mechanical explanation. I assume that controversies about representation follow a clear linear sequence. First, a paratextual promise made through marketing or platform promotion, the upstream cause. Then the aesthetic delivery of the story itself, what I label as the symptom. And finally, the ideological capture, when critics or audiences politicize whatever failures they detect. In other words, I imagine that the problem lay in the gap between promise and delivery, that outrage was the final step in a predictable change connecting promotion, narrative, and reception. It sounded neat on paper, almost too neat, but when I began analyzing real cases like The Rings of Power and The Little Mermaid, the data refused to behave. That usually happens. Three puzzles, it's the word I found to reflect better. Sorry if sometimes the word sounds a little strange. Three puzzles didn't fit that linear initial model. I coded all these materials into a spreadsheet, as you can see, and I can give more details about my methodology and coding processes in the Q&A if anyone is interested. What were those puzzles and how they changed my approach and my initial hypothesis? First, the timeline puzzle. In The Little Mermaid, for example, the ideological battle began long before the movie existed. The dispute didn't follow an aesthetic failure, it anticipated one. It first flared up when Disney announced the casting, then hashtag surged and trended, both celebratory and oppositional, seeding the search terms that YouTube creators would later mine. Then it reignited months later with the first teaser, a 19-second clip that drew millions of dislikes, amplified by the same hashtag ecology, and turned comment sections into battlegrounds. Entire channels were already primed to interpret a film no one had seen. Second puzzle, the symmetry one. Politicization wasn't driven only by reactionary or conservative voices. The pro-diversity frame quickly responded with moral enthusiasm. The familiar representation matters discourse that often accompanies such moments. Remember, perhaps you do, those viral videos of little girls watching the teaser. Each side framed the same event, a 90-second teaser, remember, through a different affective register. One of moral uplift, the other of irony, sarcasm, or even pedantic humor. The polarization was symmetrical, but the emotional vocabulary diverged. And third, the missing link puzzle. Across the production cycle, from the first teaser to the film's release, I expected users to say, it's bad because it's woke. But I didn't find that openly. Instead, the most visible comments, those surfaced by the algorithm and amplified through likes and replies, focus on things like lightning, CGI, pacing, or fidelity to the original. They mocked the film's tone, questions its look, but rarely mention politics directly. Mockery and pedantry became the dominant styles of dissent. Humor and craft talk used to dodge moral confrontation. It doesn't mean the complaints about CGI or pacing were wrong. Many probably were accurate. It means that we are seeing an aesthetic coding of dissatisfaction, a translation of moral discomfort into the languages of craft, irony, and humor, a safe or natural register for expressing discontent, even when that discontent remains ambiently political. So the data suggested something counterintuitive. People weren't arguing about ideology explicitly. Perhaps were they translating moral disagreement into aesthetic language? That was a real mystery to me. And it forced me to rethink my model my initial model completely, because these three puzzles left me facing the exact challenge articulated by Michel Condit about decoding abilities and counter-rhetorics. So those puzzles pushed me to rethink the whole structure of how controversy works. The more I looked, the more evident it became that outrage doesn't start after a story fails. It starts before the story even begins. At first I had imagined this simple linear change. Marketing creates a paratextual promise, the text delivers or fails to deliver that promise, and audiences then politicize the failure. That was the old model, but evidence, as I said, didn't fit in. What I found instead was a feedback loop, a circuit of anticipation and confirmation. It has four main moments. First, the paratextual trigger. Casting news, trailers, or thumbnails ignite the initial spark. They set the moral and aesthetic stage before the story even exists. Second, the anticipatory framing. Influential voices and articulation agents interpret those paratexts, establishing the competing moral and aesthetic scripts that audiences will later test. Third, now the textual encounter. The film or series finally arrives, and audiences, already primed by those frames, experience the text through those lenses, confirming or resisting what they expected. This stage also shapes how later reception and amplification unfold. That's the fourth moment. Reviews, memes, and commentary recycle the same scripts across platforms, turning interpretation into repetition. And that's where the feedback loop closes and restarts. Those amplified reactions feed into the next wave of paratext and framing, preparing the ground for the next controversy. This is the feedback circuit that I call the anticipatory battle of frames, where the text becomes not the origin of conflict, but its testing ground, because the battle starts earlier in the paratext. Expanding on Jonathan's great theory, for our analytical purpose, we can distinguish two kinds of paratexts. First, the symbolic paratext. It is a paratextual element, like a casting photo in this case, or a poster, that operates primarily by challenging a pre-existing cultural script or iconographic memory. In this case, the Disney animated movie from 1989. This symbolic paratext can stage a moral debate. Second, we have the narrative paratext, like a trailer or a synopsis. It purports to represent the story's internal world building, tone, and craft. This invites a debate focused on fidelity, coherence. In practice, most paratexts combine both dimensions to varying degrees. Yet one mode typically predominates in framing audience expectation and shaping subsequent reception. These materials, therefore, do not merely promote a film. They stage an interpretive contest over what the story will mean before anyone gets to watch it. This anticipatory mechanism has become a routine industrial practice in certain cases, a form of identity-based marketing. The past decade, for example, we've seen a long list of race or gender-swapped reboots such as Ghostbusters, Ocean's 8, Doctor Who, Anna Boleyn, James Bond, that finally didn't happen, even Snow White to a certain degree. The Little Mermaid offers a telling example, I believe. When Disney changed the face of a cultural icon, literally in this case, that symbolic shift before any frame was shot became the first paratext of the controversy. It created in parts of the audience what we can call a semiotic rupture in a franchise built on nostalgia. The moment that image circulated, the battle lines were drawn. Or to borrow Gray's analogy, with, in his case, a paramedic or a parasite, Jonathan Gray says, a paratext constructs, lives in, and can affect the running of the text. So the casting itself, in this sense, was already part of the text metabolism, shaping how audiences would later read it. And once that image circulated, it immediately invited competing modes of interpretation, different ways of deciding what the change meant. This is IA. I think it's funny anyway. That's, sometimes it's catastrophic, but sometimes it can do funny things or at least useful things. On one side, we have frame E, the moral or political frame. That side judged the paratext through the language of justice and inclusion. On the other, frame B, the aesthetic one, This side shifted the discussion to fidelity, tone, or craft, insisting that it's not about race or gender, it's about quality or art. But these two frames, while competing, operate differently. Frame A, the moral one, assumes a stance of justice and inclusion, which are noble values. This creates a rhetorical asymmetry. Directly questioning frame A can appear socially hostile. As a result, those in frame B often adopt aesthetic language, focusing on craft or fidelity, as a safer or socially validated register of dissent. This pattern, I believe, matters because it shows how ideological disagreement often shifts form. Instead of being stated directly, it gets translated into the language of aesthetics. In other words, aesthetic judgment can function as a socially acceptable proxy for ideological discomfort. And crucially, adopting one frame or the other is not just an act of interpretation, it's an act of belonging. Those bubbles that someone here knows very well. Each frame performs a small gesture of allegiance within the moral economy of platforms. To speak through frame A or frame B is to position oneself publicly inside a community of stance and affect and shared values. This dynamic will later help explain why practices like copy-paste or shitposting become so prevalent. They turn these frames of belonging into repeatable, ironic performance. These frames operate not merely as individual opinions, but as shared interpretive scripts circulated by what we can call articulation agents, influential media outlets, critics, hashtags, and YouTubers, among others. But this doesn't mean, of course, that audiences are passive or easily influenced. They actively seek out and selectively adopt the vocabularies that best resonate with their prior expectations and affective alignments. In that sense, the pre-articulated script functions less as a command to follow than as a ready-made vocabulary audiences can strategically deploy to express dissatisfaction in legitimate, culturally sanctioned terms. One striking manifestation of this selective uptake is tone and intention. In my YouTube sample, irony emerges as a dominant affective register. Rather than openly rejecting diversity, many users perform their criticism through sarcasm, parody, or exaggerated pedantry. This tone is not incidental. It's a discursive adaptation shaped by the platform's moral and algorithmic economy. Irony allows participants to voice discontent without explicitly challenging the dominant affective norms of the platform environment. So it keeps critics safe by turning it into performance. Framing dissent as humor rather than hostility. In that sense, irony can become a form of aesthetic camouflage, an adaptation that turns ideological discomfort into culturally acceptable performance within the outrage circuit. By the time the text finally arrives, the interpretive battle is already in full motion, an ongoing negotiation rather than a mechanical reproduction. So what we see then is the full feedback circuit. Controversy begins long before the text, circulates through promotion and reception, and then returns after release through platform logics that amplify and re-encode the debate, feeding the next cycle of anticipation. This is where the feedback loop fully closes. Those early frames usually don't vanish once the story arrives. They come back to shape how the work is received and judged. Once a film or a TV series enters this pre-polarized environment, its craft becomes, as I've mentioned, the testing ground for those competing frames we've just seen. the text itself then becomes the arbiter of the battle. It can either confirm or dissolve the controversy. This raises a relevant methodological question. How can we evaluate aesthetic claims, especially those advanced within frame B, without simply taking sides? How do we move beyond matters of taste or preference and towards criteria that are analytically accountable? We mentioned that at the beginning. My answer is a concept I call aesthetic accountability, a way to evaluate how well a story earns the symbolic promises made around it. By accountability, I mean something specific, the degree of coherence between what a text promises paratextually and what it delivers narratively within its story world. In other words, does the film deliver what it implicitly presented, promised? Does it translate symbolic claims into believable character agency, coherent motivation, and emotionally congruent storytelling? This idea, of course, builds on a long tradition of reception theory. Joseph's horizon of expectations, Iser's implied reader, or even Hall's encoding and decoding model. What is new here, I believe, is applying it as a diagnostic tool for a distinctly contemporary problem, that anticipatory and polarized controversy designed and amplified by the platform ecosystem. So this is not merely about expectations, but about how those expectations are engineered through paratext and politically mobilized before the text even exists. It also resonates with a long lineage of film theory from cognitive theories like Noel Carroll or Murray Smith, who argue that our emotional engagement with a story depends on its ability to maintain clear affective congruence and consistent character allegiance. I believe this is where accountability can become epistemologically operational. It does not measure taste, but rather the degree of the narrative's own success in meeting the criteria for coherence that these theorists point out. When that paratextual contract holds, audiences feel narrative integrity, a sense that emotion, form, and intention align. When it collapses, the reaction isn't merely aesthetic disappointment, but moral unease, as if the work had broken a promise. Because narrative form is one of the main channels through which stories negotiate ethical meaning, or representational or diversity. A failure of craft can easily masquerade as a failure of ethics. That's why a bad twist, a tonal mismatch, or a hollow ending can trigger moral outrage. That aesthetic failure feels like an ethical one for both frames. Aesthetic accountability then aspires to be not only an opinion, but a diagnostic relation between promise and delivery, between representation and execution. What this framework ultimately aspires to produce is epistemic clarity, if possible. It reclaims aesthetic form as a legitimate site of knowledge about representation. In doing so, I try to bridge the cultural and cognitive approaches that have too often been opposed, showing that ethics and form are not rival interpretive modes, but interdependent conditions of meaning. To ground aesthetic accountability in practice, I outline a framework that I've called the diagnostic triad. It's a way of locating not taste or preference, but an analytical indicator that signals structural cracks in narrative coherence. It shows how a story draws on its world building, characterization, and tone to earn the expectations it sets through its paratext and overall aesthetic design. This triad maps three recurrent modes of breakdown, the points where promise and delivery drift apart. First, narrative friction, a logical failure. These are inconsistencies in world building or motivational logic that disrupt immersion. Think of The Last Jedi. The Holdo maneuver introduces a convenient world-altering device that retroactively weakens the story's internal rules. The resulting gap was seized upon by right-leaning commentators who interpreted the flaw as evidence that a woke agenda had overridden lore. Conversely, Rambo: Last Blood, I'm not saying it's a good movie, but it's an example from the other side, reveals the same type of friction from the opposite end of the spectrum. Its theme plot and reliance on stereotypes flatten motivation and narrative coherence, which left-leaning critics took as confirmation of a xenophobic Trump-era worldview. In both cases, narrative weakness becomes the evidence that ideological diagnosis feeds on. Second, emotional dissonance, a tonal failure. Here, the cues of emotion don't match the situation. This is what we could call, following Noel Carroll, a failure of affective congruence. In Sound of Freedom, again, I'm trying to go to different parts of the political aisle, the heroic action thriller tone clashes with its grim subject matter, producing dissonance that several critics interpreted as evidence that the film served a right-wing moral panic. The other pole, Don't Look Up, can offer a progressive mirror. It promises sharp satire but ends in earnest apocalypse. The tonal shift from irony to, quotes, sermon undermined the tonal integrity promised by its marketing, and climate skeptic voices quickly reframe that aesthetic excess as evidence of elitist moralism. Across both examples, the tonal contract collapses and the aesthetic failure becomes moral or political ammunition. And third, rupture identification, in this case a relational halt. This is a failure of what Murray Smith labels as allegiance. This occurs when characterization or focalization flops. In Game of Thrones, for example, Daenerys, an earned heel turn, breaks 7 seasons of allegiance between viewer and character. This was captured by competing frames. Was it a problem of misogynistic fans or simply unskilled creators? Richard Jewell, by contrast, invites sympathy for a victim of injustice while portraying a real-life female journalist in ways widely seen as graciously misogynistic. This inconsistency fractured alliance for several parts of the audience and was interpreted by critics as evidence of Clint Eastwood's cynical culture war agenda against the media. In both cases, rupture exposes how quickly a break in empathy can be politicized. Together, these 3 forms of breakdown, friction, dissonance, and rupture reveal how structural weaknesses in storytelling become ideological lightning rods, or can become. They show why aesthetic accountability needs clear criteria to separate genuine failures of coherence from the rhetorical noise of polarization. These 3 forms of breakdown pinpoint where narrative coherence gives way. Once we identify those cracks, a deeper question reemerges. When some audiences react angrily, are they responding to ideology or to genuine flaws in craft? That question leads directly to the next step: how to ensure that this framework remains rigorous and not just another way of dressing taste as theory. This brings us to 2 familiar risks in audience research. First, interpretive overreach, reading the ideology into aesthetic complaints that never make it explicit. If people say bad CGA or weak writing, how do we know we're not projecting ideology onto neutral comments, assuming that every aesthetic judgment secretly means woke, or for the other side, reactionary? The second one is analytical redundancy. If everything is polarized, if every release becomes political before it even drops, then what analytical traction do we really have beyond the truism that everything is political? That's precisely where the discipline of the diagnostic triad comes in. It doesn't eliminate interpretation, impossible, but I believe it can constrain it by setting clear anchors that can make disagreement productive rather than arbitrary. So the triad doesn't measure personal taste, it tests internal coherence. The question is not, did I like this? But did the story break its own rules? Take friction, for example. I didn't like the plot, or I found it silly. Instead of saying that, we could argue a character crosses continents in a single scene without explanation, breaking the temporal logic the series itself established. That's what can make, I think, the model, at a certain extent, replicable. Analysts may disagree in interpretation, but they can still point to the same textual evidence of a structural rupture. The triad distinguishes subjective dislike from demonstrable narrative failure, and in cases of representation, from portrayals that feel unearned within the story's own logic or the contrary. Everything we've discussed so far, the promises, the frames, the triad, operates within a larger architecture, the platform ecosystem. This system don't just distribute stories, they engineer anticipation. Algorithms learn what excites or enrages us and keep feeding that loop, creating a kind of affective pre-commitment, an emotional down payment made before we watch anything. This dynamic is part of what Perry and Sobierak describe as the outrage industry, an infrastructure that turns affect into currency. In this sense, outrage is not an accident of reception, but the condition of circulation itself, a business logic built on what we now commonly call rage baiting, the paradox of engagement at the heart of some social media platform logics. Once paratexts begin to circulate and anticipatory frames start their battle, emotional volatility already becomes a resource to be monetized in what Panet Weiser calls the economy of visibility. This dynamic obviously doesn't always lead to capture, ideological capture though. Some works manage to neutralize it, as we would see Black Panther or the third episode of The Last of Us show how coherence can absorb early tension. When craft and ethics align, representation feels inevitable, familiar rather than declarative, leaving little room for capture. In short, outrage thrives on acceleration and absence, on a culture that moves faster than its own fictions can process. Let's see how this circuit I have explained plays out in practice. The Little Mermaid provides a textbook example of a controversy that began long before the story existed, as I've mentioned before. Rather than focusing on the plot or performance, the debate crystallized around a single image, the first official photo and teaser revealing Halle Bailey as Ariel. That moment condensed everything we've been tracing, the early framing, the affective polarization, and the feedback loop that re-energized discussion once the film was released. From that moment, the two interpretive frames locked into place. Frame A celebrated the casting as a long overdue act of justice, a sign that Disney was finally listening. Frame B countered by shifting the ground. It's not about race, it's about fidelity, CGI, blah, blah, blah. Both sides were speaking about a film that didn't yet exist, yet the argument gained emotional traction because each frame highlighted what the other downplayed. One emphasizing moral affirmation, the other aesthetic evaluation, simplifying it. Moral celebration invited aesthetic defensiveness, while aesthetic critique reinforced moral urgency. Social media platforms amplified this exchange, rewarding effective expression over nuance and turning outrage into a marker of relevance. When the first trailer or teaser trailer arrived, those earlier expectations had already hardened into filters. Its muted visuals and uneven tone didn't cause the controversy. They seemed to confirm it. For many viewers within frame V, aesthetic flaws were taken as evidence that the project had been doomed from the start, as if the diagnosis has already been written and the film merely supplied the exhibits. On the other side, frame A read the same material as confirmation of moral progress. The trailer's very existence, however imperfect its execution, was interpreted as a signal that symbolic repair had finally entered the mainstream. Its representational gesture outweighed its aesthetic limitation. What happened here was not a failure of representation itself, but a failure of synchronization, I believe. The symbolic gesture, the picture, the announcement, the casting announcements arrived before the story could sustain it. In other words, the representational claim preceded its narrative grounding, leaving a vacuum that outrage rushed to fill. Or as I like to put it, the symbolic act opened the door, but only narrative craft can hold the room. The Little Mermaid thus illustrates the full circuit, from paratextual promise to anticipatory fragment to a textual encounter that either confirms or resists those pre-formed expectations. In this case, the promise came too early and the controversy filled the gap. To see the contrast more clearly, consider Encanto and Coco, another Disney milestone in diversity. Its paratext also sparked early discussion, but once audiences engaged with the finished film, narrative coherence contained rather than amplified the tension, because its ethical and aesthetic intentions were better integrated into the story world. Representation there felt organic rather than declarative. The same logic we are seeing applies to the Rings of Power, though the controversy there crystallized around narrative paratexts, the early trailers, casting announcements, and production stills, rather than a single symbolic image. Once again, the debate predated the text. Fans were already arguing about fidelity, tone, and canon long before the first episode aired, and the production team as well. As in The Little Mermaid, before the premiere, the two interpretive frames were already in motion. The moral frame celebrated inclusive casting and the renewal of Tolkien's world for a new generation. The aesthetic frame quickly rallied around the idea of fidelity to Tolkien's lore. This isn't about politics, it's about respecting the source. That appeal to fidelity is telling, because it's a powerful rhetorical anchor, because it fuses aesthetic and moral judgment, asking not only, does this feel like Middle-earth to you, but also, does it honor the original? In that sense, appeals to fidelity can operate as a form of, the term I mentioned before, aesthetic camouflage. Not because viewers set out to make ideological claims, but because the discourse itself can displace ideology into the language of craft. By the time the series launched, many viewers were already engaging with it through one of these two lenses, each offering its own ready-made vocabulary for praise or critique. So how does the Rings of Power hold up through the diagnostic triad: friction, dissonance, and rupture? Friction appears most clearly in the Numenor arc, where decisions and travel collapse into implausible speed. Within just a few episodes, cause and effect start to wobble, and the world's own logic feels thinner. Dissonance emerges in the Harfoot plot, where sentimentality and apocalypse coexist almost without transition. The shifts in tone outpace the story's emotional grounding. So a lot of the audience felt the effect, but not the justification. Rupture finally becomes visible in Galadriel's arc. Her motivation changes so abruptly that our allegiance falters. We follow her less with empathy than with confusion. When cause and effect feel earned, when tone and emotion align, the story world holds, as in the Elrond during scenes which deliver better the coherence the trailers promised. But when rhythm, tone, or motivation slip, those promises fray. In this sense, there was no single flashpoint that suddenly ignited the controversy around Rings of Power. What seemed like a breaking moment, a trailer drop, a scene, a thumbnail, was in fact, as I mentioned before, a crystallization point, the moment when meanings that had been forming for months finally become visible. The text didn't generate the conflict as much as consolidated it. Each new trailer or episode became then a way of confirming or challenging the frames that audiences had already adopted, whether those frames were celebratory or critical. On platforms like IMDb, the most visible negative reviews weren't overly ideological. They were long, detailed, and deeply invested in questions of craft. Diversity was mentioned only in passing, almost as a background racket. On Instagram or on YouTube, by contrast, irony, as I mentioned before, took over. Reaction videos and comment sections filled with sarcasm and repetition, a blend of the copy-pasta, trolling, and shitposting humor that turns critique into performance. The tone shifted from argument to ritual. Irony became the social language of dissent. Professional critics, however, read the show differently. Rotten Tomatoes, which is an aggregator, registered an 84% approval from critics, but only 38% from audiences, a striking gap that mirrors two distinct accountability regimes. Critics largely judge structure and ambition. Users responded to rhythm and affect. These patterns of reception show how aesthetic judgment becomes a way to negotiate disagreement without naming it. The Rings of Power wasn't just caught in an ideological battle. It became the site where moral tension was translated into questions of artistry and taste. If we systematize the two cases, we see how the circuit operates consistently even when the inputs are different. Taken together, The Little Mermaid and Rings of Power reveal not two separate logics, but two phases of the same anticipatory circuit. In both, outrage begins before the text, one through a symbolic image, the other through narrative paratext. And in both, the finished work reactivates that energy by confirming or frustrating what audiences of each frame already expected. Each exposes a different weak point in the loop. The Little Mermaid shows what happens when the symbol runs ahead of the story, while the Rings of Power shows what happens when the story fails to stabilize its own promises. Both cases remind us that representation falters not through visibility itself, but through misalignment, when moral ambition and narrative craft fall out of sync. And that, in the end, is the terrain of aesthetic accountability, where ethics and form stop being rivals and start becoming each other's evidence. In that sense, The Little Mermaid and The Rings of Power illustrate two variations of the same anticipatory mechanism. In the Disney live-action movie, outrage coalesced around a racial symbol, the transformation of a beloved image tied to nostalgia and the Disney universe. In The Rings of Power, it centered on racial and gender representation and the perceived violation of lore fidelity and the Tolkien canon. Both cases reveal the same tension. Inclusion was framed as a moral achievement rather than woven into the narrative world. The result was a sense of dissonance, like a good intention that struggled to find its story. This framework, which treats ethics and form as interconnected evidence, is precisely what allows us to diagnose the central confusion of these polarized debates. This brings us to the core insight of the model, the confusion between the symptom and the disease. This is the iceberg metaphor in action. When we look closely, the so-called anti-woke critics are often not wrong about the symptom, the visible tip of the iceberg. They are detecting something real, a break in coherence, a jolting tone, a sense that the story isn't holding together. The problem lies in the diagnosis, what is happening beneath the surface. The anticipatory frame B discourse, already shaped by articulation agents, has pre-framed the likely disease as diversity itself. What we're seeing is not a misunderstanding of aesthetics, but a structural instrumentalization where genuine craft weaknesses are seized upon as evidence and channeled into ideological confirmation. I believe that aesthetic accountability can provide us the corrective tool. It'll help us in two ways. First, it separates the real symptom from the false diagnosis. If the triad finds real friction, dissonance, or rupture, as it did in the Rings of Power example, we can validate the symptom while correcting the diagnosis. Yes, the story is structurally flawed, but the disease is poor craft, not representation itself. Second, and perhaps more crucially for navigating polarized discourse, the triad can help us identify false symptoms. This is, I believe, essential for cases where representation is achieved well through a strong narrative craft. Consider the third episode of The Last of Us Season 1. It is a widely acclaimed and structurally coherent piece of storytelling, yet it faced some significant aesthetic criticism online, and also political or ideological criticism, but I'm interested in this aesthetic criticism online within frame V discourse, often disguised as complaints about pacing or being filler. When we apply the triad rigorously to these specific aesthetic claims, we find no significant structural failure to support them. The episode's deliberate pacing is integral to its affective goals. It's a love story between these two guys in an apocalyptic world, not a flaw. Sorry, I was saying its deliberate pacing is integral to its affective goals. It is not a flaw. The filler claim, therefore, mistakes the episode's thematic structure for a plot-based structural flaw. This same method reveals how coded aesthetic complaints were levied against other coherent works like Get Out for race or Mad Max Fury Road for gender. The triad cannot reveal intent, but it can reveal evidence or its absence. When aesthetic language floats free of any demonstrable textual flaw, it stops diagnosing and starts signaling a rhetorical move within the framing battle rather than a genuine critique of craft. So when outrage evaporates in the face of good storytelling, we can learn something simple, but I believe interesting. Representation doesn't collapse when it's done boldly. It collapses when it's done badly. To conclude, this framework isn't about reconciliation. This is not a peace treaty in the cultural wars. It's about clarity. It's a radiographic tool, a way to see through the noise and locate what's really broken in a narrative, if anything is. I believe it makes three contributions. First, it maps controversy as a complete anticipatory circuit, showing that outrage is structured, not spontaneous. Second, it turns aesthetic accountability into a diagnostic instrument, a way to distinguish real structural flaws from rhetorical signaling. Third, it helped us see how aesthetics and ideology keep borrowing each other's language, how craft flaws get moralized and moral claims get aestheticized. But I believe this can also work beyond academia. It can offer creators a shared vocabulary, friction, dissonance, rupture, to pre-diagnose coherence in their own work, bridging the gap between creative intent and audience reception. In doing so, it reframes the ethical stakes for the industry. Ethical representation is an act of narrative craft. Failing at coherence is in itself failing the promise of representation. In other words, ethical storytelling isn't about winning the culture war, it's about earning belief. Representation isn't just an act of casting, it's an act of world building, motivation, and emotional truth. It succeeds not when it signals virtue, but when it feels inevitable. Thank you. Okay, as there is no food, no one can throw me tomatoes or watermelon or something. But no, seriously, I really, I've come here to learn. This is a new field for me. So please feel free to hit as hard as you can, because that's what can make me improve these arguments that I think are reasonable, but perhaps are lacking things. Thank you.